Hi, Patrick. I'm so glad to have you here and talk about this. I met you just prior to 94 when we were talking about the conference, but it's been a real pleasure getting to know you, getting your feedbacks, things that you shared with me then, a little bit here or there. So I just want to talk about your experience with the Enneagram and when you began and what you think is important, maybe what was lost along the way, anything that you find valuable. So go ahead and begin.
Let's talk about what's pretty well accepted as the beginning. So the circle, the Enneagram circle, is more ancient than any of us who deal with the Enneagram. And I think it's also important to understand that starting with the 1970s or late 1960s, we have an Enneagram of personality that is entirely distinct from the Enneagram that was known to the Eastern self-help groups, the people that would have been with somebody like Gurdjieff. They would not have known anything about the Enneagram of personality. That is an invention pretty much of the 1970s. It starts with Oscar, but it's really Claudio that does it. And then when we wrote our first book, because we're the first published work, after that, there is a definition to it and it takes off.
Yeah.
It was our book that first made this a published fact and revealed the Enneagram of types, personalities, and went into that kind of track as opposed to what had been prior to that. So we have the circle, fascinating geometric doodle. Lots of interesting things you can do with it. I'm not sure exactly all the various things that are done with it. I do know that the Sufis do their dances around that circle. They do understand the 9 energy points. The early material that was talked about, and you'll find in works like Bennett and Uspensky, they talk about energy. They talk about the energy moving around the circle and the fact that there are points of energy in which the energy is different. I think this is probably where the personality typing got its foundation. They also talk about how in a somewhat ideal utopian world, you'd possess all of those energy styles. So therefore, whatever task you were mastering, whatever activity, such as one of the books talks about baking a pie using the Enneagram, things like that. That sense of energy at points is what I think gave rise to the personality types. Along with Gurdjieff's, he challenged, I'm using a light word, he basically blasted his students right out of the room with accusations of how they were being, in his understanding, stupid, that is, ignorant as to their true identity, their true essence.
Right.
And so all of those things contribute little pieces. And I think current students of the Enneagram think that these things just popped up fully grown, like Venus from the Easter shell. I mean, it just was there. You had the 9 types. They all had names. They all did this, they did that, and so forth. Well, that's just not true. And I know that personally because when we learned the Enneagram, much of what current Enneagram people think and take for granted simply did not exist.
Right.
Just recently, I saw a rather interesting thing where someone posed colors for the 9 types and got waxed all eloquent about how these were defining of the types and how they came down from the true tradition. Well, the true tradition began with a bunch of Jesuits sitting in a living room in Chicago. We put the colors on the Enneagram. And then it was furthered by Maria Biesing and I musing about the fact we only had a negative color and we wanted to write a positive Enneagram. So we came up with a negative and a positive color for each Enneagram type, and thence began the colors. They did not exist before 1984.
Well, they did through Naranjo and Kathy Spieth,
Yes.
but weren't in the same way. So for example, not teaching the way you're saying, but like this handout, can you see it? The colors are assigned to each type, but they're explained in a very, very different way.
Yes.
Not
Yeah.
at all. Yes.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Same with the animals.
Right. The animals are on here.
I was a Jesuit, member of the Jesuit religious order of the Catholic Church, an ordained priest for 30 years. That included a long period of study, 15 years to be exact. And during that period of time, we Jesuits would take 4 years to study theology. Now, frankly, the amount of theology that's usually required of a Catholic priest would take 2 to 3 years. So our period of study is much longer, much more intense, covers all sorts of things that aren't in the usual curriculum. And that gives rise to the fact that Jesuits are pretty renowned for their theological savvy and good to be confessors, particularly because of moral theology and ethics. But the point I'm trying to make is that it gives us a lot of other time, leisure time. When you are a full-time student, you have unbounded leisure. It is something only those of us who have been to college can appreciate. And so here we are really in our postgraduate studies. And there are 15 of us. And this is how the class came to be. Bob Ochs, who was a professor of theology at the Chicago, we called it the Jesuit School of Theology at Chicago. And that school had been moved from North Aurora, its previous location. And it moved around a lot over the years, but it had been moved recently. And during that move, Bob Ochs, who was on the faculty, had decided to take a sabbatical, and he went out to Esalen. And while he was at Esalen, he studied with Claudio Naranjo. He spent the entire year with him. And Claudio found Bob so apt for the work he was doing that he designated him one of his very few teachers. I have that from Bob during that, or not from Bob, but from Claudio during that interview we had with him. And so he wanted him to convey the wisdom of the Enneagram. But like all the people who were in this Eastern learning style, you were usually sworn to secrecy.
That's right.
That it was information and wisdom, more wisdom than information, to be conveyed from the master to the student. And so when Bob finally was talking about the Enneagram with us, he began with the caveat that he wasn't supposed to be telling us this.
Right.
He then proceeded to tell it to us anyway.
Because he had signed an agreement with Naranjo that he wouldn't, just as Naranjo had signed an agreement with Ichazo that he wouldn't.
Correct. Yes, you can see that these no compete clauses don't work in any world, do they?
So Naranjo said that he was very curious about what Jesuits would do with it. He had great reverence for the Jesuits and did give Ochs permission to do it internally, but he was very, very curious. He also said that in a way he upset Bob Ochs by bringing in a fourth way teacher to a training. Were you in that training?
No, I was not.
And so he feels like he let him down, and that's why he ended up exposing it, so to speak. But did you guys all agree not to say anything the way?
That would be very difficult in the climate that we were in. We were in an academic environment. Not all of the 15 of us were Jesuits. I don't know. I think there might have been 4 that were in another religious community, but most of us were Jesuits. There were several of us who took it up and used it in ministry in a variety of ways. But Jerry and I are the only ones who kept with it. Okay. But there were a lot of other Jesuits, which, sometime if you want to know all this, somebody else interviewed me on this, and And I teased all this out, this information about who was involved, when, and how, and so forth. But I'm going to try to hit the high points. If you want to come back and do the special stuff, we'll talk about it later. But anyway, here's, first of all, Ochs was persona non grata as far as we were concerned as a teacher. I say that because as a scholastic, that's a Jesuit, not a priest teaching, he taught in a high school in Detroit where I went to high school, and he was one of the worst teachers you can imagine. He could not control the class, and that just doesn't make you a very good high school teacher. And he was too cerebral. Now, Bob went on and got all kinds of doctorates. He earned a doctorate in theology and German, and he earned another one in philosophy, I believe. And he's brilliant beyond words, but he was so cerebral that he just couldn't connect. Whatever happened at Esalen disconnected and put him back in touch with the real world. So here comes Bob. Now, first of all, we are now living in the south side of Chicago. Let's just call it now, because we have a famous person from there, let's just call it the Barack Obama neighborhood. And we were involved in all kinds of neighborhood stuff, and we lived in 6 flats. So 3 flats on either side of a central open staircase. And one of those flats would be a kind of recreation area. And we would form a small community in these. Bob was in one that had faculty members, but he cleared all the furniture out of his living room. And we conducted class sitting on his living room floor. But we had to buy a zafu to sit upon, because the class he was offering was called Religious Experience. Now, Bob the nerd, who didn't have any credentials as a teacher, because as a theology teacher, he was even worse. And he, on the first day of class, he gave you the option that you could skip class and just write the paper and take the final at the end, which we all opted to do. So Bob didn't have to teach. We didn't have to be bored. So he was really a non-teacher. But here he comes back in bell bottoms, flowered shirt, long beard, long hair. Bob was cool. He was cool. And so we figured, maybe there'd be some grass in it. We didn't know it was going to be Eastern meditation styles. It was something we didn't already know about, because Jesuits, are supposed to meditate every day, and we practice a kind of meditation which is pretty unusual. And so, but we were willing to learn anything, and it's the 70s. Everybody's trying to find out new stuff. So we signed up for the class. Well, Bob went on and on and on about, we practiced these styles. That was the best part, was we got to learn how to meditate, do different things. And probably one of the most profound books I've ever read was offered to us early on, and that was Bob Arandas's Be Here Now.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And so Bob had us. He already had us because he was talking sense for a change. This was something we could grab onto, and we desperately wanted. And you've got people who are grown adult males who have spent most of their life in heavy academic study and a great deal of introspection. So we are not at all casual or shallow in terms of our self-understanding. And so he's presenting these things to us. And I do not remember exactly how he started in Under the Types, but at some point or other, he started to illustrate the point he was making by describing a type. And before long, he was spinning it out. And I'm highly suspicious it was type number 1, because that was Bob's type, and he talked endlessly about type number 1. I would often say, Bob, we know enough about ones. Let's move on to another type, Bob. And anyway, once he started and we understood that this was coming from some kind of wisdom formula, we wanted to know more. So whatever Bob had intended to teach in that first semester ended up being mostly Enneagram. Because we were already, used to community living, and the best part about having all this time to study things was you had a whole audience to try out the ideas with. So no matter where you were, there were these conversations going on. And once the Enneagram got into the buzz, oh my goodness, did it take off? Everybody wanted to know. So all of the 15 of us would spend our lunches and dinners teaching the Enneagram to new people.
Yep.
Okay, so this is how it's starting. You already have a group of highly trained teachers, and now you're teaching them something. Well, of course, the first they're going to do is teach it to somebody else.
Exactly.
So we convinced Bob that this was way too important to just have one semester. So we asked for a second semester. So if you think about this, this is a 4-hour class. So we probably met twice a week for 4 hours each, or 3 times. I don't remember, but you can figure that there were multiple class or seminar hours because it was a graduate seminar. Plus we were all supposed to do an hour's work, personal work on it every night. Probably met 3 times a week now that I think of it. Anyways, this goes on for a whole year. So we had an intensive immersion in the Enneagram. We were living, thinking, talking the Enneagram. And every time we met in class, we were bouncing this off, each of us talking to each other. Well, Don, is that your 3 coming across here? Are we hearing your success oriented? And, Roger, you're way too far on the 4 end here. Come on, enough drama. We can, and so on. Very much the way probably Gurdjieff did it with a much heavier hand. And so we were immersed in it. Meanwhile, the word got way beyond Chicago because we had friends who had friends who had friends who had friends who had friends. And most of us were doing other things with other people beyond the Jesuit community. So they got to know too, many of them communities of religious women, and nobody talks about ideas like religious women and share them. They're all over the place. So the ideas were just percolating, and people outside Chicago wanted in. So Bob agreed to do what we called the cram course. It was spring break, 1971. And our class started in the fall of 70. So this is 71, the spring.
Well, that's confusing because Naranjo in 1970 in the fall was in Arica, Chile. And he only did 5 of the 10 months, but he said he didn't start teaching till 1971. And actually, Arica wasn't formed till 1971 because they hadn't finished their training. So that's a point of confusion. Is there a way you can make sense of that?
Only if Bob started.
No, I know one thing important that I could add in is that Naranjo had already met Ichazo and was trying to encourage people at Esalen and the Friends of the Friends to go to Arica, Chile, to that 10-month training. So I'm guessing that perhaps he was talking about the types then, even though they didn't begin that course till July 1st, 1970. But you get people interested, and quite a few people, 54 Americans, North Americans, came.
Sure.
So
Sure.
that's probably how that happened.
The only thing that could move it up is if we started this in December or January. But I know that we were finished the year in June of 71 because I was ordained then. I knew it, the Enneagram, and I took it to Seattle or the Tacoma area.
That makes sense, Patrick. I could really see how that could fall into place, because if Bob was on sabbatical for that year and Naranjo was there and then gone and then back at the end of the year and then got his group together to formally teach, that totally fits now.
Okay. Well, I mean, it might be important for us to kind of piece that a little more exactly, but because I know Bob was gone a whole year, And whether it's, I'm presuming it was an academic year. That's normally how you do it. You don't, and
Exactly. So Naranjo said that Bob was considered in his SAT group for one period, but then had to go back. And then it was a 6-month period that he only taught Seekers After Truth for 2 years, 18 months, actually. And they were in segments of 6 months. And that Ochs attended one, but he had to go back. But Naranjo went to Esalen every chance he could, and he loved Fritz Perls. So they would have all been together, hanging out at the Baz and talking.
Sure.
Philosophy. Yeah. So that makes total sense. Got it.
And I know that I heard this later. Bob never talked about, he did not talk about the Esalen experience. He didn't talk about the people he knew or met. Now, he was an intensely private person, a very strong introvert. So that's not unusual, but we didn't know any of this backdrop. We didn't know the personalities. He didn't tell us who these people were. If he talked about Naranjo, it would have been in passing, So it was only later I found out, for instance, that Helen Palmer had sat in on the panels when he had done that.
Yeah. Naranjo said, no, she didn't. That the only thing she did was come to open discussions. So Naranjo every April would go to Unity Church and talk about whatever book he was writing. And Helen confirmed that.
Mhm.
They did not sit on the panels, but she did with Kathy Spieth.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that was her way to differentiate from Dawn, was that she had a more direct connection than Dawn did. But actually, they both ended up learning cross training from other people.
Well, and even Don owes his to what I'm about to tell you next.
Great.
Okay. And that is that Bob decided to do this cram course. So it was in the spring of 71. And there were, I'm going to guess, about 30 people. There might have been more. I don't exactly remember. But the people that were in this group, and I can name them for you sometime if you want that data, but they became the powerhouses of a spiritual revolution that was going on in a lot of different areas, specifically centered around the spiritual exercises of Ignatius in the Jesuit or Ignatian tradition. And a lot of women who were religious and then lay people beyond that became very, very involved and interested in the spiritual exercises. And they became the best prepared spiritual directors, far better than most Jesuits who lived a life supposedly according to the exercises and had made the full 30 days twice in their life, whereas most people were lucky if they did it once.
Yeah.
So, and it was a very exciting time to be there because everybody was trying something new and was willing to take a lot of chances. So in this group are the powerhouses. Among them are Tad Dunn, who was a theology teacher, not much older than me, that was teaching theology in Toronto at the Jesuit School of Theology in Toronto.
So you were going to say that the people mentioned Tad first, and you were talking about the women.
Yeah, and there were some people up in Toronto who were prominent there and subsequently left the Jesuits. But before they did, they were very significant theology teachers in Toronto. And a lot of Jesuits did their theology in Toronto. And so they were subjected to or exposed to the Enneagram through these people who decided that it was a useful tool to further some spiritual teaching as well as the psychological. And so one of the people who was exposed to this as a result of that cram group, and he was exposed at least a year later, was Don Rizzo. He was at that time a philosopher. Jesuit training is broken into segments, or at least it used to be. So he would have been, as I'm sure he was when he died, still about 7-8 years younger than me. So he was in his, I was at the end of my training. He was still in the middle of his. And he was exposed to the Enneagram. And the material had come out of what you can understand that by this time, Bob would have distilled down. And much of it was because we were academics, we were taking notes the whole time. And he kept insisting there was nothing printed. And so we composed notes, and we came up with a sizable, I still have the notebook of notes from our class that we would summarize what we thought he was teaching.
Like a paragraph on each type, like that Don gave out during certification?
Yeah, that paragraph I put those paragraphs together and disseminated them all. And I would have people come back to me when I would be teaching a seminar, and they'd say, look what you said there's nothing published. Look what we found. And I said, yeah, you'll notice my name's been taken off of that.
That happened to me with all my subtype research. They just took my name off and people started teaching it and using it. But that happens. But
yeah,
it's good to know that, because from what I could surmise about Bob Ochs, it wasn't his style. And I have them because Don said they were important because it's what he had to use. And he had to intuit the rest of it. And that's why it took him 12 years. But that's a wonderful piece of history to know, Patrick.
Don was much quicker than 12 years. Okay. He had the material because when our book, there was a book published in 92 that was a plagiarism. And
because there was a book in 92 as well, but it was mostly on the centers, but it was still Enneagram.
No, this one it has a green cover. If you want to see it, I'll pull it out of the shelf for you. But it was put out by a nun. A little hard to understand what congregation she belonged to. I don't know if you're Catholic and if you know about congregations and all those sorts of things. But anyway, she was with a group down was in Tennessee. Anyway, she seemed to be kind of at the fringe of the Catholic Church. And so she got hold of the notes that I'm talking about that had my name on them. And they were 10 pages long. And I used it as in that single-spaced writing that I used as a kind of primer for teaching the Enneagram. And she had a copy of these, which she claimed to be unidentified. Now, maybe somebody had taken my name off of them, but they did have my name to start with. So somebody deliberately removed it. And she claimed that all the material in her book was from unidentified sources. Well, she couldn't have gotten all this material without having plagiarized it from sources that were extant by that time.
I would love to know her name because I can't find anything published. And so, Pat, I was wondering about what you were mentioning when you met Don Rizzo and Maria Biesing.
The first point I was trying to make is that there was a continuity of core material, because in the case of Maria, she had learned the Enneagram at the Jesuit retreat house outside of Cincinnati. It's Milford Retreat House. And down there were several staff members who had either been on that cram course I mentioned from the spring of 71, or had learned the Enneagram directly afterwards from people who had been there. So people like Jerry Hare, who had learned it while he was doing his theology in Toronto, had learned it from Colin Maloney, is the man I was trying to think of his name, who had been in the cram course and took it back up along with Tad Dunn, and they had taught it up in Toronto. And that's how Don Rizzo learned it. He was in another phase of training. So I don't know how many years later he learned it, but he learned it also in Toronto. And he left the Jesuits shortly afterwards from Toronto. And then I didn't run into Don until the plagiarized book by this nun. And that would have been 1982.
Yeah, that actually sounds right, because if he said it was 12 years and it came out at the very end of 87, that means he would have learned the Enneagram in 1975, if his 12-year marker is correct. And that would be about right, because that would be also when Kathy Spieth was teaching at ITP and had the year-long training, which is how I learned the Enneagram, from Kathy Spieth's note.
Yeah, right.
Someone at a course on symbols, and the author that was teaching the course said, "Hey, does anybody know the modern application of this symbol?" And this woman sitting right next to me said, "Yeah, I do. I took a year-long course on it." And she just talked a little bit about it. And I go, I learned more about that. And so I learned from Kathy Spieth's training manual and this woman teaching me. And later, everybody I could study with. But yes, it's so interesting, because other people like Tom Condon never had a formal teacher. He had notes in Berkeley.
Correct. And Berkeley, but see, these are all places where the Jesuits had a school of theology.
Yes.
There was one in New York. No, Maryland. The School of Theology was in Maryland. There was one in Toronto. There was one in Chicago. There was one in New Orleans, and there was one in Berkeley. So wherever these Jesuits were going, the Enneagram was following them there, or had preceded them. And so very quickly, so I'm telling you that the cram course was 71. I think by 72 or 3, they were already using it in the novitiate to train young Jesuits. Certainly by 75, it had some beginnings there. But a lot of things waited for our book, because there was no printed matter, and most people like something solid, especially when they themselves have not received the initial information. They want something that they can work with as a teacher. But the Jesuits who were doing formation were people who had been in Chicago with me. So we were all first, let's just call us the first generation of learners.
Yeah, that makes sense.
From Bob Ochs.
Especially as a group.
Yes.
And that's what appealed to Naranjo, is a group of knowledgeable people. And
all learned at roughly the same time, in roughly the same way. Now, our group would have had super saturation compared to everybody else, but it still was an academic pursuit. And we all realized the two values of it, that it was useful as a psychological tool, but it was also very, very useful as a spiritual tool. However, and this is where we would have, say, gone on a different tangent. I think most of us who found it as a spiritual tool would have found it very useful in spiritual direction. There's a part of the spiritual exercises where people learn how to do discernment. And discernment is paying attention to the inner movements of your spirit. And that takes some training, and it takes some hard work. And the Enneagram is very, very helpful here, because Ignatius talks about, and by the way, this is all in our book in 84, about the discernment of spirits and how you use it this way. But he talks about these contrary movements that you have things that move with your better self, move you towards good, move you in a harmonious way, and then you have the ones that move you in the opposite direction. Well, Ignatian spirituality differs from all the other religious traditions in all the churches in this one singular, and that is, it starts out by saying, God is all good, God made all things are good. So if all things are good, there's no battle between good and evil.
Yeah, that they're just energies.
They're all good. It's just, what are you going to do with them? Water is good, but if you drink too much of it, you'll get sick. If you don't drink enough of it, you'll get sick. It's not the water, it's how you use it. And so even air, you can hyperventilate. So this insight is it so separates the way of doing any kind of spiritual growth. And so when the Enneagram came along, if you look at the 9 types as gifts of personality that can be misused rather than an inner fight between your essence and your ego, that's another way to look at it. But I'm saying, if you can look at it, and that's what we chose to do in our book. We said it's a gift and you have to choose. How do you want to use the gift? Where it moves into spirituality. And that's quite different, I think, than what I hear a lot of people doing, where it's much more
healthy and unhealthy, like that it's
well, yeah, it's that too, but it's also how they use it spiritually as almost a trance inducer. And you don't have to have a trance to have a good spiritual experience.
No, you don't.
No. So
Naranjo said that he thought that Ochs liked the idea of sin and redemption.
Oh God, yes.
Which is why he used the lines, even when Naranjo said, no, that you go both directions. But that's Naranjo's understanding of why he carried on teaching.
And that's probably where Ochs started with us, because the one thing that came very clearly from him was this notion of the original sin. Yeah. And we just picked right up on that. Remember, we've had all this theology.
You guys know.
We are loaded for bear. And, even if a bumblebee walks across the sights, you're going to let go with everything you got. And so we jumped right on top of that. And we must have drowned it in verbiage before he got control again, because we could see such an easy understanding. If original sin is something has, in the theological notion, if it's something that has to do with who you are, not something added to you or placed on you or even inherited, it's just who you are. The Enneagram fits that perfectly. So you don't spend your life trying to rip this thing off. You spend your life trying to, if you want, make love to it so that it's fruitful.
And the other thing that he said was that the way Ichazo introduced it was based on, if we want to symbolically say, the teachings of the Desert Fathers, that there were vices and virtues.
Yes.
And there was no fixation until 1972. When did you learn about fixation? So there were the passions, vices, and virtues.
The type had an ego name. So ego resentment, ego flattery, ego vanity, and so on, which dovetailed with the vice. It's a complementary virtue for it. And I'm pretty sure that was part of the original material. Because we didn't, we came out of this year, we were so facile with this that all we needed was the numbers. We had no names. We didn't even use these ego names most of the time. And so the type number became very important. And we would talk endlessly about, what type 7s do and how they get along with type 1s and, so on and so forth. And that was sufficient because we all were so knowledgeable. But it became real clear as soon as you started teaching neophytes that you needed something else to grab to. So people began hanging things on the numbers that were typical of them. And so names began to evolve. When Maria and I wrote our book, we tried, as we said in the beginning, to be as true as possible to the sources we had at hand. We gave attribution because we did not want to fall trap to what that woman had done in her book. So we tried to attribute every idea to somebody And if it wasn't somebody's, if it was ours, then we could claim it. So the whole section on discernment is our own material, but much of the other material we gave credit where it was. And so if it's in our book, it was part of that original teaching, because that's what we had in common up to that point. But what we started to add with our book were, for instance, these two colors. The growth and the decline of each type was symbolized by a color, as well as other things. We hooked up the arrow movement to the discernment piece. So the arrow movement we had, but it was the discernment piece we had to bring in. And it's at this point, there was immediate confusion because the 3, 6, and 9 arrows originally had no direction. We put a direction to it and then changed it.
Yeah, that's what Naranjo said.
And you know, when anybody starts doing things about the history like you're trying to do, you know, we have to be really clear. This has been an evolution.
Oh, yeah.
Every one of us who had something, I don't mean the casual folks, the folks who just, you know, kind of tossed it around and made a party game out of it, and maybe even had a deck of cards that had no substance or whatever it might be. But the point is, anybody who took it seriously and worked with it over a period of time has contributed something to the theory. But people have to understand it is not cast in stone. It's an evolving thing. And if you like this piece of it, fine, but let's not go to war with somebody over whether or not that's original Enneagram stuff, because it's not. You know, if you want to know what's original Enneagram, start back with our book in 84, because it's the first thing published. And that'll tell you, and you can go forward from that. If it's not in that 84 book, it did not exist. And all that includes the wings.
Yeah.
Because the wings, as
And
they were
kind of there either. So, I mean, they were published in the handbook of Kathy Spieth, but it was not published in a separate book.
Right.
And same with the Ichazo, they just had notes for their trainings. And I've seen everything that Ichazo did. Someone who was actually in Arica, Chile, and another gentleman who just recently died, I became friends with when I lived on Maui. And that's how I happened to go to Ichazo's intensive and what have you. But it's truth that they were different bodies. Like it was really Naranjo taking Ichazo's work, adding psychology. And then from there, people added different things. So there, in my opinion, 4 very distinct disseminations of the Enneagram. And the Catholic dissemination just doesn't have the subtypes, but it has those that added it, then they do. But that's specifically Naranjo.
The subtypes got an extra boost when Don decided to multiply them by themselves. So he was not happy with 27. He had to have multiples of that. In complexity lies either great wisdom or an attempt to obfuscate. You can take your choice.
Yeah.
You know, I don't, Occam's razor appeals to me very strongly in this sense. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be, because as a 1 will tell you, then you're going to should all over yourself.
Yeah, sure. And he was a part of the book too, was he not? Bob Nogosek, it was you, Maria.
While Helen, I don't know what Helen was doing in the 80s. I'm sure, though, that she had a group of followers by that time.
Intuition. She was teaching intuition.
A whole other set of chapters is the founding of IEA.
I was there when Don gave up the term and you were all on the panel, but that's a whole nother story. Yes.
Yeah. But it's relevant because here are the people who claim to have found the new way to understand personality and ensure better communication and peace among all people. And we had the battle of all ages trying to build the organization. So, and somehow or other, I find myself the last man standing.
You and Rusty.
Yeah. Well, you came along later.
Yeah.
See, there's phases here.
There are phases. That's right.
And original ideas were percolating in different ways in different places. So down at Milford, they were teaching this to spiritual directors. But up in Cleveland, where I was at another retreat house, another Jesuit retreat house, I was using this at first with spiritual directors because that's how it got pulled out of me. I was teaching a seminar just on spiritual direction. It had nothing to do with the Enneagram. And I hadn't even thought of using the Enneagram. I had ample opportunities. The summer after I learned it, I was in it's called clinical pastoral education.
Yes.
And people in ministry usually do it volitionally. It's usually not required, and I spent a summer, 12 weeks, working in a rehab hospital in the timber country around Tacoma. And so my patients that I was responsible for were the worst of the worst. You know, I'd have motorcycle accidents that had rendered some very fine young man a quadriplegic, or the one that really got me the worst was a 30-something-year-old man with two wonderful, beautiful kids. This guy probably didn't finish the 6th grade, and he was making his life as a lumberman, which meant he went out every day with a chainsaw, his lunch, a can of gas, and cut as many trees as he could in the daylight hours. And one of the trees fell oddly and came down on him and broke his back. He laid there for a day before they found him, and he was a quadriplegic. And to see the love from his family and the way he got back to functionality was just unbelievable. I mean, talk about courage. And then I saw a surgeon who had dove into a swimming pool when he was drunk, and you know, he was a quad too, retrained himself as a radiologist, and then committed suicide. So it was this whole spectrum. People with strokes, you know, kids that have been in terrible accidents. So they were my patients, and I was learning how to be a good minister. And I had a supervisor who was a really talented and very knowing man. He was a Lutheran minister, and 3 other peers, and we would have peer reviews of our job. You know, each of us would sometimes do a verbatim, and we would share it with the group and act it out, and then the group would critique it. I mean, talk about scathing criticism.
I bet.
And this is right after using or learning the Enneagram, so I'm getting it all over again. It's like the next layer of frosting on this thing. And but I didn't use it. And so this is some months later, maybe even a year later, and I am teaching this seminar, and I decided, well, the best way to teach them is to role play. I will be the directee, you be the director. And so I'd sit across for somebody, and of course the whole group is there, 100 people or whatever, and that person would be my director. And what I did was I went into one of the types to demonstrate the sort of thing that happens in spiritual direction, but from the type. Well, I didn't even finish a few of the types before they said, you're working off of some kind of system. There's a blueprint back there. This is too true to life.
Yes.
And that's how I started teaching the Enneagram. So it's always been kind of pulled out of me. You know, people said, this works, let's do something with it. And so from then on, I had the opportunity to advertise it and have people come to this retreat center. And it was an instant success. We only had 60 rooms in this retreat center. And the first Enneagram program, we had over 100 people.
I believe that. And it was very noteworthy in the 70s that people wanted to do deeper work across the board.
In all kinds of ways.
Yes, that's
because nobody knew about the Enneagram, Katherine. I mean, it wasn't like anybody knew the name or knew what it meant or anything. They just heard this was a good thing. And once one group had been through it, I just had a woman, I was teaching the library asks people who teach. I teach at 2 colleges along with my wife, and we teach other things, not the Enneagram right now. I'm teaching one called American Democracy in Peril, and another one that's even more popular called Monks, Nuns, and Jesuits, A Habit Hard to Break.
That would be a good book or class. Are you doing a book too?
And so they ask us to do these 1-hour spot things. It's free, come, get. So I was at a local library, and I have some more this summer. And one of the women came, and she came up to me afterwards. She said, I was in one of your Enneagram seminars at the retreat house. It meant so much to me. I have never, ever understood myself as well as I did in that room with all the other people of my type. And I said, what type were you, knowing or having a pretty good hunch? She said 4. And I said, you thought you were the only one in the group.
Yeah, that's right. I was teaching at Stanford to their second year, and they get extra credit or payment to do that. And I had that questionnaire, and everyone filled it out. And I just kind of looked at everybody's, and I started teaching. And this 4 had a heart attack. Because no, I thought long and hard. It took me years to come up with these words and phrases and viewpoints. And so it was destabilizing to her at first. Yeah. By the end of the class, it was only a 2.5-day class, but it was so cultivated that she didn't think anybody would have that. But there's certain symbols and words and colors that types identify with.
Well, I like to say we gave people a vocabulary to describe their innermost self.
That's a great way to say it.
And so that's been what I've done with it. And it started out, with a role. And so, we had so many people coming. Well, then word got around. Other people I knew through a variety of other activities started inviting me to different places. Before long, I went to Japan for a couple of 1 months intensives there, and was in Europe, and we went to Brazil, and so I've had this opportunity to share it in a lot of different cultures and test its validity. That's the important thing.
Exactly. It doesn't matter where I am, Australia, Denmark, the UK, France, wherever I teach, different parts of the US. A 4 is a 4, always, everywhere, and right. All types are. Doesn't matter language. What MBTI do you identify with, Pat?
ESTJ.
My dad was the.
There's no intuition in me, and it's all in my wife. Honest to God, she's a ENFP.
Yeah, she seemed like it.
And so it's the extrovert in both of us that allows us to have a marriage, because we literally have to talk things out. No matter what it is, we have to talk them out. We always do. But I mean, she's the intuitive, and I am so sensate. And it could be right in front of me, and I would not see the connections beyond what's right there. And once you know these things about yourself, you're a little more patient with each other.
Oh, yeah.
And you just don't feel the world the same way, and that's important. But the motivations that the Enneagram present to us, I think, are the secret to success. I am less in favor of multiplication of divisions, because I just feel it. Yeah, if you want to sit and tease it apart and make a case for those things, I think that may be useful to some people. But because I'm so pragmatic, because I want to teach something that's effective, that people see the results of it very quickly, and then they can do with it what they want, I tend to go to a simplified explanation as well as a use. And so I've always held very fast to the centers. One time, my wife and I were doing a training of teachers in Northern Ireland, not the Republic, in Northern Ireland. And we got, I don't know whether we brought it with us or it came to us somehow. Anyway, we were there for 2 weeks, and it was also our honeymoon. We had our honeymoon with the nicest 30 people you can imagine. And we got this article in the Enneagram Educator that Kathy Hurley had written about her discovery of the centers in a dream, or
The two expressions of the centers, the creative and the
well,
mental.
the way she wrote about it, it sounded like she had discovered them for the first time ever, and they were brand new. And so I challenged her, and she never liked that. That was an unfortunate bit of abrasion. But the centers are so critical to the Enneagram, and they've been there from the very beginning, and they are so clearly the miracle of it that you can see right away. And then when you start subdividing, the further you get away from the origin, it's like any other thing we know of in this universe, and that is the further you get from the origin, the less authentic it is. Because distance starts to complicate the relationship. And so I've always liked to try to stay true to the centers. And when you take the wings, they won't stay on the centers. Okay. So if you happen to be a 6, you have a wing in each of the other 2 centers. But if you happen to be a 5, you only have a wing in one other center, and so on around the circle. So except for 3, 6, and 9, the centrality of the centers is destroyed by the wings. You're pulling it apart for no good reason. It's, I think, more authentic to explain a little bit like you do in the triads, that you are of one center, that's the dominant center, and you have use of the other 2 centers in varying, let's just say, strengths.
Hierarchical order and in various proportions too.
Right. So you have a kind of a secondary and a third center use, but it's the centers always. That's what I see coming out in the types. I see the people using those 3 centers. And since, they went so, the origins back in Claudio spent so much time on those centers, I don't think I can come up with something better. So,
but what's interesting is so many people teach the Enneagram and don't understand the centers. They just know there are 3, but they don't know why or what the function of the center is, or how, well, Gurdjieff is a whole nother thing, but how Ichazo defined the focus, the question the person was asking in each center.
right.
And was going to be resolved. Having certified with 3 different schools, they didn't really teach centers, except Ted and Kathy. They did.
Yeah.
From their lens of perception. But Don and Rusty went really deep in the type itself, from level of health to losing that and being more unhealthy. But the panel method was great in hearing from people, but I must say, if people weren't on the right panel, it did not help, because it would confuse people.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to encourage people to consider another type.
I think you explore, you try them on like a suit of clothes, and they may or may not fit you well, or they may or may not suit you in this setting. And allowing people to experiment with that, I think, is critical. I think that's why, at least I found, it was so important to have interactions in small groups, to let people work this out in the same way they're going to do it outside of a seminar, where you do not have a guru, you do not have structure. You're just working this out yourself with your friends. And I think that enhances the friendship. I mean, once people know this has certainly been my experience. Once you're with a group of friends who know this and use it with some facility, it changes the dynamic you have with people.
No.
You'll have the hostess saying, I'm such a 2 that I just have to overdo this. So please sit still and enjoy it. Well, it's that you start out with, here's me, I'm doing my best, but I'm also overdoing it. Please understand.
Yeah.
Or I put this in too tight of a schedule. I shouldn't have crammed this meeting in. It's my need to get too many things done in a short period of time. So let's get this thing over with. 3.
Yeah. Or I come on too strong. Well, wait, I didn't mean it that badly. I was just saying the truth. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So that is where I see the Enneagram, really enhancing lives. And if you want to take it beyond that, that's fine. But please don't make that the gospel, because it just isn't. And we had too many battles in the early years about, what wasn't and what wasn't the truth. And, it reminds me too much of the political scenes today. And
it's happening again. But in 1996 is when the intent was try to get a more universal understanding of the types, because there was so much diversity and descriptions that varied. And we worked so hard to make that happen. I was on that planning committee and you were there. So I think it helped.
Oh, I do too. But frankly, Katherine, the death or parting of the founders also helped, because all of us thought that we had some essential kryptonite kernel of truth that we just couldn't do without. And, to take one of the arguments that was part of those early years, arguing about what name to give each of the types. Now, that would have been convenient, but nobody was going to let go of their name.
Right. Because they had the copyright with the name.
Well, whatever, Point was, we never named the types. We never gave them a common name, and they have all the different names. Well, I think if you are at this point 50 some years out and you look back and you say, there's Rizzo and Hudson with a tragic romantic. Well, don't forget that Rizzo's whole lens was on psychopathology. That's where he came at the Enneagram, and that's what he wanted to teach, was psychopathology. So of course, tragic romantic works. But, here's Beasy and O'Leary trying to make gifts out of it. Well, I'm sorry, tragic romantic is not going to sell.
No.
The 3 sell, and it certainly is not really the defined essence of 4ness, says the 5, that's Maria. And so we ended up with an author, as a 4. And that was a neutral term, and it was positive. And so we may have had to do a little more explanation and have fewer jokes around the name. But the point was, each of us was trying to do something different with the Enneagram. And as such, we were pushed in different directions in terms of what we saw to be important to follow and to research and to do more on. And all of us were questing after the same thing. And it all ended up with being a very rich stew of ideas, much richer now than it ever was before, because, for a period of time there, being an author was pretty heady. You felt like you kind of sort of topped out in the universe, and had all wisdom in there, but it was also a very big responsibility. And I think some of us realized that more than others, and wanted that to get to carry itself out. So dampen the anger and move forward with the struggle, because that was important. And ultimately, that's what happened. And frankly, it was the group of people who we had reached who came back at us and said, don't do that. And I think that was the corrective that we needed. And that was very, very healthy.
Meaning don't
fight.
Yeah, the enmity, right.
Yeah, don't fight. But, they were fighting too. That was, but it's so much like the current political thing.
Yeah.
You can either feed that fire and you can make it flare up and do real damage, and you can have the ego satisfaction of having exercised power, or you can back off from that and be humble enough to let it take its own course and contribute wisdom where asked, which is what I presume you're asking from me right now.
Yeah. And how did it, I know I've asked you this a couple times when we've gone other directions, but how did you come to have the third author, you and Maria?
Oh, yes, we started on it. Didn't we?
A couple times.
I wander. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. I love
We were having these very big seminars, and we asked people not to record because we were in the process of writing our book.
Yeah.
And we didn't have it out yet, and we were taking this, as I would type out material, I would put it in an envelope and send it off to the Library of Congress. So Library of Congress has a lot of our manuscripts on this, so as to make sure it got protected. That's how paranoid we had become that somebody was going to steal this. So this was an incremental thing, that making sure it was protected. So when we would give a seminar, we asked people, please don't record this because we're trying to write a book and we don't want this to get to print sooner than we write it. So at one point, one of the people who had been with us, we had developed a series of workshops that built one on the other. And we were beyond the third one. I don't remember what iteration we were at that point, but Bob Nogosek had been present for the first three. And he came up on one of the subsequent workshops with a manuscript. And he said, this is pretty much a verbatim of what you two have been teaching. This is my contribution to your book.
Oh, so he gave you your own work?
My wife, who was not my wife at that time, has always held that he recorded it. Maybe he did. I wasn't paying attention enough to be sure of that. But however he got the material, the original manuscript that he gave us was verbatim. I do mean verbatim. He had expressions in there that could only have come from being present when they were uttered, because they're not the kind of thing you would have heard otherwise.
Exactly.
And so Maria and I took that material as the beginning, and we decided that in order not to discredit what Bob had done, we would leave it pretty much intact. It is, however, the chapter on the Enneagrammatic Jesus. This is how that happened or came about. When we would have a group come together for the second level seminar, our seminars were not like let's say a series of 6 courses leading as part of a doctoral program where they literally built, like chapters one on top of the other. These would be more like 6 offerings in the general subject of self-improvement, and we would pick a topic. So the first one we'd call Basics, Enneagram Basics, because that's what it was. But the second one we called Spirituality, because that's what it was about, was spirituality. And the third one was called Relationships. Now, we hoped that you would do them incrementally, because what you learned in the second one could be applied in the third one, but they weren't that kind of lockstep that most people associate. So when Bob gave us this thing, he had taken all 3 and squished them into one little dynamic we had used for 45 minutes in one of the 3 workshops. And what it was after they had attended the first one, they're back together again. Most of the people in the seminar know each other, but it's been a couple of months since they've been together. So we had a little dynamic, and we said, we want you to go into your type groups, and for the next 45 minutes, you discuss your type as, and I'll fill that in a minute. And then when you're done, come back and one person be the spokesman and tell us how you found your type to be present in that character. Well, we tried Shakespeare. Not enough people remembered their Shakespeare. We tried movies. Not enough people went to the same movies. We tried TV shows. Not enough people had the same taste in TV shows. Well, because this group was in a retreat house and because many of them were Christian, if not Catholic, we said, all right, how about the Bible? But you can't use the book itself. It has to be what you remember, and let's narrow it down to the 4 Gospels. So forget the Acts of the Apostles, forget Jeremiah, forget Genesis. It's got to be somewhere in the four Gospels as you remember it. So we're not going to have you spending your time looking up the Bible verses. Well, seriously, that's what people
No, I
do.
understand what you're saying. Yes.
So they would come back and they would tell us how they saw Jesus as their type. Okay. Bob thought this is a great organizer, so he has the Enneagrammatic Jesus. Well, he takes all the stuff we taught about each type and puts it into the person of Jesus. So you've got Jesus is an exemplar of the heart type when he's doing thus, such as what a 2 would do, and so on and so forth and so on. And he took all of that material around the type of Jesus. So what we have is a lengthy chapter in which each type is talked about extensively in great detail about Jesus. So we left that. And then we wrote all the rest of the book around that. And so all the other chapters were things that we thought were important enough to put into the book, and we did. So the book gets published, and that's how Bob gets credit. So he wrote the original manuscript, but only of that one section. And if you ever look our book up, you can.
I have it actually.
So it's about 45 pages out of 250, something like that. But they're very dense, and we didn't want to change it. Well, I don't know, a year later, whatever time it took, I got a call from my provincial superior who would act as the bishop in my case. And I had to go and have a lengthy conversation with him about my book. Now, he had approved the book because in the church, if you write a book, it has to be approved by your superior or your bishop. Well, that wasn't good enough for the bishop. So then I had to go not to my local bishop, who was 100% behind me, but I had to appear before the National Conference of Bishops, a subcommittee on my heresy.
Is that like 83 or after you published the
83, 84. No,
Uh-huh.
we wrote the book in 84. My mother was dying a little after this. I mean, it all came together one time. We got sued. That's another chapter. This is all happening at once. So I'm beginning to think, I'm not so sure I wanted to be an author of a book anymore. All these strings come attached. Well, then, which I can tell you, nobody else had. Nobody else had all these things happening. It's just because I was the first. I was making all right. So it's 1980. I don't know, 5, 6, somewhere along there. And I get a call from Helen Palmer. And I didn't know Helen Palmer. I mean, I knew who she was, but I didn't know her. And Helen is distraught. This is my first encounter with the woman, and she's saying things like, they're going to, I forget the language she used, but basically they're going to tear me apart. I'm being sued. What do I do? How do I handle this? I've never had this experience before. Can you help me? I just don't know what to do about this. And I've asked people and they have no help. And so I arranged, and I met Helen. We met in New York.
This was before her book came out in 1988, January of 88.
Yeah, this is long before that. She had already had warnings from the Arica people. And we had already been sued by the Arica people.
That's right. I have that in letters to the school. There's so many things documented, so many different directions, but yes.
Well, yeah, I guess I never saw most of those letters to the schools. So
It's a book.
It's a book?
Yes.
Oh my.
Arica made it into a book.
Oh my.
A long time ago. I probably got that in the 80s. So
it would have been after 84 when the book came out. It would have been in the next year or so.
Yeah.
So they sued the three of us. They sued the publisher. They may have sued our religious orders, but it wouldn't matter because the three of us all belong to 3 different religious congregations I belong to an order, but that doesn't make any difference when you're suing. And we were vowed with vows of poverty, so had no personal assets whatsoever under the law. And the organizations we belonged to also had no assets under the law. And so there were no pockets to delve into. So they sued the publisher as having some pockets, although this publisher was not a particularly well-known one, Dimension Books, and they published a very small circle of books. So they didn't have deep pockets either. And so Arica was trying to find some way to make somebody pay. Now, what we knew from our sources was that Arica, and you can authenticate whether I'm correct on this, had pretty much burned out as a thriving organization. They had had their day in the sun. They'd had their $2,500 seminars, made a lot of money, but the interest and enthusiasm had kind of died out, and they were pretty much reduced to a small-time operation. Is that correct?
Yes, and they kept everything private. So there wasn't the influx of people, in my opinion, for the same. Whereas the Enneagram itself has gone through various stages of expansion and contraction, but never contracting all the way back. But you have to sign to even purchase a book. You have to check, even online, that you will never use that material. And what's interesting is I just recently got a couple books because I'm explaining the difference between trifix and tritype. And in the book that I got, it even documents that he didn't teach trifix until 1997. And so I found it in 1994 at the time of the very conference we were talking about. But I assumed that it must have existed before and that I just found what he found. But he never really did anything with it. His focus was the body and what system it was related to, just a very, very different focus. But now they're coming out with a book more specifically including trifix, because it really wasn't in there. And Jack Labanuskas interviewed Ichazo in Hawaii, and then he came up with 2 paragraphs on trifix. So I just thought, well, isn't there something more you want me to add so I can help people understand? They go, no, it's just the fixations of the 3 types, not the full type, only the fixated belief. And I said, oh, and that was in 2007, actually. And then I separated my work from Ichazo because I realized, and they realized, it wasn't the same thing. Yes, it involved a type from each center, but what was taken from that and used was very, very different. And so we did. And I used tritype. I'd begun with 3 types and trigram because I was trying to figure out, and tricenter, those were my 3 terms. But when I heard of trifix, I just thought, from one of his teachers actually, that, well, I don't want to confuse people if it's the same thing. But they didn't know either because he hadn't really taught it. So like in our world, the way we learn the Enneagram, we go deeply into it. And everybody wants to learn it for themselves if they're so inclined. But with Arica, you literally are taking the data and learning that piece and then moving on piece by piece, but you aren't doing your own delving into anything. So when I was at the intensive with Ichazo and his people, a lot of people there, it's a reunion intensive, which he did every 5 years. And I just asked them, I was going to confirm whether they knew anything about subtypes, because I knew it was Naranjo, but I thought, oh, here's another opportunity to prove that. And then Ichazo had spent the morning talking about a process. And I said, oh, well, this is what I call Enneagram of process. And I had used a particular example. And then when I met Naranjo, I asked him about it. And he said, oh, yes, there is. And we actually had the same example, very similar. And I had roles for each type. Everything you and I are going to do, if you're doing something long enough and you see a pattern, you're going to want to make it easier for people. Well, he was halfway through and it was a break. And I was with David, and we were just talking to a group of people. And David was saying, "Oh, Catherine, well, where do you think he's going to go with that?" And so I said, "Oh, he'll say this about the one, this about the two." And then I went through just like casually. And they said, "How can you possibly know that?" Oh, I said, "I don't know what he's going to say. But based on where he's going, if we consider the Enneagram of process itself and that it's a continuum and what he said already, that's just a hypothetical perspective and Scott. So what I said came out at the end when we went back after the break. Ichazo and Naranjo had kind of merged some of their material in the early days. Then they differentiated over the dispute with Kathy Spieth and Bob Ochs teaching the Enneagram. And Naranjo said, "I was a coward. I just left." He didn't want to be accountable for that. But anyhow, so they took out the spiritual components that Ichazo had, stayed with Ichazo. They took out a lot of the psychology. But Naranjo felt it was really important to keep it in there because it helped explain other nuances at the same time. So then we ended up with two very different Enneagrams. There could be new things coming, but pretty much.
And frankly, Catherine, you would know this as well as I do. Now that much of that enmity is gone, well, I think it's all gone now. Can actually talk about the historical events and what they were doing. So.
Yes, it's a delight to me. We'll carry on.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Catherine. Take care of the dragon.
Yeah, I will.